the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. Good morning, everyone. And happy Easter. All right, that's pretty good. Y'all are kind of halfway there. Here's what we are, though. We are Episcopalians at this church, and so Episcopalians have a funny way with language. We like to jazz it up when we can. Happy Easter and good morning are not appropriate greetings on this day. For 2,000 years, roughly, throughout the world in every language, there's a way to greet other people of faith on this day, and it goes something like this. It's a two-part thing. It's a call and response. One would say to the other, "Alleluia, Christ is risen." And traditionally, what the other one says back is, "He is risen indeed, alleluia." Being Episcopalians, we just want to, who's he? Might as well say it again. So we say, "Alleluia, Christ is risen." And then the response back is, "The Lord is risen indeed, alleluia." Want to give that one a shot? Alleluia, Christ is risen.
The Lord is risen indeed. Alleluia.
You can do it slightly better than that, I'm sure. We can mic you if we need to. Alleluia, Christ is risen.
The Lord is risen indeed. Alleluia.
Much better, with confidence and gusto. I like it. Good. I hope that feels like the proclamation that it is. I hope that feels great to say. I hope it's so hard to say without smiling. It ought to be. It can be a little challenging sometimes. It can be a little challenging to live lives that feel like that as well. We're going to talk about that here for a moment. But for a second, what I want you to focus on is that is a proclamation. It's not a celebratory thing. I think on the front of your bulletin it says a celebration of the resurrection. Celebration doesn't even get us halfway there. This is a proclamation or it's nothing. And what I mean by that is it is a statement about the truth, the reality of the universe that is different than just a remembering of something that happened maybe 2,000 years ago in Palestine. That's not how that works. If Christ is risen, then the universe is changed, and to say, "Alleluia, Christ is risen, the Lord is risen indeed, alleluia," is a statement about the fundamental reality of this world that is so different so often than how we experience the fundamental realities of this world. To say that means that the tomb truly is empty, that we have nothing to fear of death, that you and I know that we worship a God who has conquered anything that could possibly cause us grief or despair, right? We are so well acquainted with all sorts of different types of death or things that death seems to control. Death in our physical bodies, biological death. We're acquainted with death in our relationships, within our spirit, within our emotions, with our spouses, with our families. We know what that looks like. To say Christ is risen is to say that even when we experience that, God has reigned victorious over it because the tomb is empty. Right? It's to say that what Isaiah promised long ago is true. And Isaiah was speaking to people who are well acquainted with grief, I promise you, grief that you and I can barely even understand, right? They had seen all those different kinds of death and more. These are people who had lost their land, lost their country, lost their temple. They believed that they had basically lost their God, lost their religion, lost their families. They lost everything. Everything was under the shroud, the shadow of death. And Isaiah says to them, "But there will be a day, I promise you, when God on his holy mountain will destroy death, cast away the shroud. There will be a day on that holy mountain," where, I love this line, "where God will swallow up death forever, even though it seems like death has swallowed life sometimes." I wonder so often what it would be like to live in that reality, right? I wonder. And Mark tells us that that promise has come true, that on this day where a couple of women approached the empty tomb of Jesus and they wondered to themselves, how could it even be that we are going to be able to push this stone away? They find out that it's so true that the stone's already rolled away and the body is not there. That promise has been fulfilled. And sometimes when I think that I can't match up to it, I realize that there has been this gift given in the Gospel of Mark. And I'm not sure if you notice it, so let me draw your attention to it just briefly. In all of the other Gospels, you get something of what you would expect on that Easter morning. You get angels and trumpets and loud voices. You get all the praise and magnificence of a promise being fulfilled that had been set and established for hundreds of years. And in Mark, you get restraint. You get a disorganized following of Jesus who thought they had lost everything. You get fear. And truly, what I think the best word is to describe it is you get disorientation. Disoriented toward the world that they are living in. But disoriented in the best way. Because the alternative is to stay oriented to the way things were. To stay oriented to a world in which death seems to have won. To stay oriented to the world that you and I often find ourselves living in, instead of being reoriented to the truth of the proclamation that the tomb is empty. All the great gifts from God seem to me to fit that pattern of changing our fundamental orientation to the universe, to what we believe to be true about the universe. Two things stand out to me as being the sort of the utmost truth in my experience of how that happened. When I fell in love with my wife, everything that I believed to have been true about who I was and the universe that I lived in suddenly seemed different. I hope you experienced that as well. When I fell in love with my children, when my children were born, I remember so vividly the tears that came with the total disorientation to the universe that I lived in. Nothing was the same. Everything that I had believed to be true before suddenly paled in comparison to the truth that I knew that God had given out of God's great love in that moment. Right? I hope you've experienced that disorientation before. Because again, the alternative is to be oriented toward a world in which death swallows life instead of life swallowing death. For me, the shameful part is that in those moments where I feel it so much and I know it to be true and I change my orientation toward it, that can be such a fleeting moment. It's so easy to slip back in, to reorient my life to something other than that promise of God. I want it to somehow make its way down to my heart in such a way that I never forget it, but every year I come back to Easter and I need us to proclaim that Christ is risen so that I can remember how I ought to live tomorrow. There are so few people that I know that seem to live that way all the time. They are saints to me. They are ones that help me think about how my life could be different. I want to share a story of one of them because as it is, when those folks who really seem to live that way all the time, when they know that Christ has risen, when they live as if God has conquered death, their life is always so different. And that is especially true when they approach their own biological death and when they begin to treat that as the lie that it is. That's when I really get to see it. And I have a friend going through that process right now. Dick is the name of a friend of mine that I met in church in 2008 in New York City. He's a remarkable human being filled with a fierce kind of love that very few people know and a courage that is hard to describe. It's one that had been tempered through years and years of facing down death. Death primarily in the form of hatred. Dick was born in 1935 in, I think, either Lexington or Louisville, Kentucky. And at a very early age, he knew that he was a gay man. 1935, 1940s, in Kentucky, you better believe that he faced down hatred all the time. Visible, life-threatening hatred for him. In the 20s, in his 20s, to try to escape from that, he moved to New York City. And even though we think of New York City as being this incredibly progressive place, in the 40s and 50s in New York City, even advanced though it might have seemed, it was not. He couldn't have a drink in a bar in public if he was known to be a gay man. You know that alongside that was the struggle for civil rights that came for the African American community. And Dick was so inspired by the faith inspiration and the nonviolence of that community that he wondered what his own community might experience if they began to live out of the same place of courage. If they truly began to say that because the grave is empty and the shroud has been cast off and death has been destroyed, that they have nothing to fear, perhaps can live differently. And he did. And they did. They did their own civil rights movement. They did their own nonviolent protest. And they changed the world around them so significantly. So 6 weeks ago, at 73 years old or so, no, he's 73 when I met him. I don't know what he is now. 83. Oh my gosh, it's been 10 years. Dick received a terminal cancer diagnosis just about 6 weeks ago. It would be the last fight that he has to fight after a life of fighting and struggling. And while it breaks my heart to receive the news, it didn't even come close to breaking his heart. What Dick did was remarkable. It's what I would think any of us would do if we truly believe in resurrection. He gathered his family and his friends, and he had his funeral about 6 weeks too early while he was there. They gathered around in church. He's never missed a Sunday, I don't think, in his entire life. They went to church. They had all the prayers for the dead that they would have that they could put in the kind of future tense when you die. And they celebrated the life that he lived. What they did was read to him the letters that he's received from presidents even who have commended him for his work to change the fabric of America to a more equal place. They, more importantly, surrounded him with their love, and they shared in the joy of the resurrection. A joy that can't be conquered, not by cancer, not by death, not by pain. I want to live like that. I want to live so fiercely believing that the resurrection is so real that I could attend my own funeral with all the joy in the world. I want to live with a fierceness of belief in the resurrection that's so real that I don't just come back to my faith year after year looking for some sort of peace and comfort, but instead for strength and courage. Strength to conquer and face those things that try to push me back to the orientation that I had toward death before, and step back into being disoriented, reoriented toward God's great love that can't be conquered by death. I want to live that way. I don't want mere peace. I want strength. I want change. I want my life to scream out with all the proclamation that it can that Christ is risen. That our God cast light out of a dark tomb, destroyed the veil of death that has been shrouding God's own people. I want to live as if every part of my life says that God's victory is complete and there is nothing to fear. That God has already won that victory. That when Jesus said, "It is finished," he meant it. And that I mean what I say when I say that Christ is risen. And I hope you want it too. Maybe today can be one more day where you approach that story and know that it is a story that can change your very life. It can reorient you toward a new truth about how the universe truly is. And so today, we might say, "Alleluia, Christ is risen. The Lord is risen indeed. Alleluia." Try it again. "Alleluia, Christ is risen. The Lord is risen indeed. Alleluia." Today we can say it with our lips. And tomorrow let us live it with our lives. Amen.